Hey, this is going to be the class PowerPoint / video for Cubism and Abstraction. We're going to start today by talking about this man in this photograph. You might not have seen this photograph, or this painting. It's not very well known, but this is a very early self-portrait by Pablo Picasso. He was a child prodigy artist who was born in Malaga, Spain. His father was an art professor who nurtured his early talent. Picasso was doing beautiful academic style paintings and drawings of the human figure by age 12. He was sent to the Royal Academy in Madrid, and upon a graduation, he began to experiment with many of the current styles at that time, including Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, and also a style a little akin to Cézanne's. But he hadn't quite landed on what would become his own style, his own voice. While he was still in his early 20s, one of his best friends committed suicide over the betrayal of a lover, of a girlfriend. It was after this devastating loss that Picasso began a style of painting that was a little bit more reduced, and maybe related a little bit stylistically to the romantic and realist work of Daumier and Toulouse-Lautrec, which would be known as his blue period. And here's an example of that. This is another self-portrait of Picasso at this time. And as you can see, obviously, he was working in tones of blue to express his feelings, to his melancholy, his sense of loss. But at the same time, you can also see that he's abandoned the academic style. He's working with very flat form. He's not worried about modeling. He's using outlines. He's not worried about space or volume. So he's really paring down to create the simplest shapes, simplest forms. And he stayed in this for a couple of years. He wanted to make himself look like he felt in the world, which was kind of alone, lost, weary, hungry. You could also see that he viewed himself as kind of a character full of angst in this world. By later in 1905, his situation had improved. He was feeling better. He wasn't quite as grief-stricken. And he began to sell quite a lot. He was this new style of his was beginning to catch on, and dealers and collectors were buying it. And his work takes on a new tone of color. And this is an important work in that early period, which they call, so after this blue period comes this period, which they call the rose period, where it's much more upbeat. The colors are less dour. But as you can see from this portrait, which he calls the family of saltimbanques, it's not exactly happy. You can see that this group of what look like circus performers, who are the saltimbanques, kind of standing in this space that they occupy together, but they don't seem very connected to one another, which is kind of interesting. This is a group of acrobats that just seem to be kind of hanging out together in between their work, although they're wearing their costumes. And I think one of the things that Picasso was trying to say in this piece was that these people, like he and maybe other artists, are outsiders, people who live outside of the mainstream of society. Historians believe that this may have been in Picasso's mind, a portrait of himself and his circle of friends. But you'll notice that although they still look despondent and disconnected, the palette has become lighter and warmer, and you can see that that there is that kind of warmth in the color, if not in the expressions of the people or their body language. So his paintings are still somewhat filled with angst. this idea that that he's not connected to the world around him. He's an outsider. He's a misfit. That kind of thing. So very shortly, so this painting was done in 1905, and this painting was done in 1906, 1 year later. Look at the difference. 1905. You can see that the figures are all pretty well observed. They're naturalistic. They're fairly classical in their proportions. They relate to their environment. They have there's a ground line. There's a sense of atmosphere. But by 1906, 1 year later, he has pretty much abandoned that. And not only has he abandoned that kind of reference of the figure in the landscape, but he's also abandoning the reference of the figure to nature. You can see this is another self-portrait. It was done in 1906, as I said, not too big, it's 36 by 29 inches. And you can see right away that he's starting to abstract the figure. So just take a few minutes and take an inventory about this portrait, and you might actually want to compare it a little bit to this portrait that was done 5 years earlier. Notice how different he looks. It's the same man, but he's giving himself a much different quality. Instead of being lonely, lost, and full of angst, look at how young, naive, innocent he looks. And you might even ask yourself, what has he done to give himself that look? Why? What about this portrait of him makes him look so young and innocent? What makes it look so naive? It's very interesting. So one of the things that influenced Picasso at this time was that he had the opportunity. Although he's Spanish, he was living and working in Paris at the time, and he had the influence to see a few collections of non-Western art in Paris. There was he'd seen some primitive sculpture of Gauguin, and he'd also seen some ancient Iberian figures on display at the Louvre. Picasso was a Spaniard, and these Iberian figures are also from ancient Spain, Spanish area near his birth, near the Pyrenees in Spain. And he identified with them, and he loved them. And these Iberian sculptures, actually look a little bit like African sculpture as well. And I don't think, actually, let me look at my PowerPoint. Later on, I have some pictures of some of the art that influenced him, but not just yet. So he was very influenced by kind of the rawness and primal quality of these sculptures, and how the artist captured the essence of the human without having to describe exactly what that human looked like. And he wanted to be able to do that too. He wanted his painting to capture more the essence rather than the look of the person. And so it's kind of interesting. So I'm going to just go over with you some of the things that he did. You'll notice that it is malproportioned, and he did this intentionally. Look at how large the eyes are compared to the rest of the face. Look at how malproportioned the arms are. The arm that's holding the palette on his left side is almost completely obscured by the palette itself in a way that would be not quite proportional. Whereas his other arm, the right arm, his painting arm, which isn't holding anything, is abruptly foreshortened in a way that doesn't look quite right. You'll notice that the modeling of the body also isn't quite right. There's a very strong line across his chest where his collarbone would be, but it's far too high, and it doesn't quite sit like the bones would sit on his figure. You'll also notice that a lot of the body is outlined roughly in heavy dark color, and so he doesn't look naturalistic at all, and he hasn't tried modeling just a little bit. And so he's trying to give this kind of naive look to himself, and he does, right? He looks a lot younger. He looks a lot more innocent, and he's looking to show that. He's looking to show that kind of innocence. Painted at around the same time was this portrait portrait of Gertrude Stein, which was done in 1906 as well. And it was interesting. Gertrude Stein was a famous contemporary writer, also living in Paris. And you can see that Picasso makes Stein look, really imposing. Look at how she's kind of leaning over into our space, and her face is lit with this kind of keen intelligence. And more than anything, she looks very, very smart, right? Her face comes glowing out of this relatively dark picture plane, and her body is kind of large and hulking. She looks like quite a presence. She's imposing. And he's also he again added the bold outlining, and he simplified her form to give it a stronger, a more powerful look. A critic remarked upon viewing this painting for the first time that the portrait looked nothing like Gertrude Stein. And Picasso's response to that was something like, "Oh, well, it will." And of course, what he means by that is that people like me, people like you don't remember, you don't know what Gertrude Stein looks like. How you'll remember her maybe is how Picasso showed her to us. So he's banking on that her painting, her portrait by him will endure more than the photographs of her, which I think is kind of interesting. He was a very confident person. All right, so the piece that's on the AP, and this is the run-up to this piece, is this one. And this is one of his most seminal early works. He goes on to formulate more than one style. He has a very long, storied career, and he does a lot of really important work throughout his career. But it's with this painting, which is called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, or Young Ladies or Prostitutes of Avignon. This painting is the painting that really launches him. It's the one that makes him stand out and distinguishes him as a leader of the avant-garde, a leader of the cutting edge of art. The Khan Academy art historians called this this painting the dawn of 20th century art. Here is the dawn of the modern era, and let's unpack why they think that. So the first thing, let's just try to get kind of figure out who these people are and how he's showing them. Demoiselle is likely a French euphemism for prostitute. So this is likely a painting about prostitutes who are hanging about in a brothel, more so than a harem. So I'm going to show you another picture. This is a painting by Ingres of a harem. Very sexual, very alluring, all these very voluptuous women waiting about. Their only job is to be beautiful for when the king wants to have sex with them. So this is kind of like this male fantasy. And part of what Picasso is painting about is about this power of women and sexuality. And in fact, this is all about women and power in Picasso's mind. So it's kind of interesting. So obviously, Picasso's women are very, very different from Ingres' harem women, right? However, are they? Look at Picasso's women. They're nude. They've got those sexy poses, right? Their arms are up over their heads. They're displaying their bodies. They're definitely not shy. But what is different? What's the big difference between the two? How are these women, although very powerful, how are these women not like these women? You don't need to answer this on the voice thread yet. Really different, right? And Picasso wants them to be different. He does not feel the same way about these women as Ingres felt about his women. So let's unpack that a little bit. How does Picasso feel about women at this moment? And how does this painting tell us a great deal about how Picasso feels about women at this moment? So this is what I'm going to ask you to write about here in this at this point, this juncture in the lecture. So on VoiceThread, I want you to tell me what you think is Picasso's opinion about women, how as we see through this painting at this point in his life. How does he feel about women? What is this painting telling us about how Picasso feels about women? And I want you to give me two reasons or two ways he tells us that. And there's a lot of ways. So I don't want you to repeat each other. If somebody else has answered in front of you, look at their answer, see if you can find a new answer. And then tell me how he's showing us about how he feels about these women. And there's a lot to notice here. So, okay, now that you've all taken some time to notice some of the things about what Picasso is communicating to us about his feelings about these women at this time, I want you to start thinking about the conventions, the painting conventions that he is breaking in this painting. So he has these really strong feelings. You'll notice all kinds of ways that you've already written down in your answer that he has abstracted them to express his opinion, to express his feelings about them. And he's very clear. I think there's no mistaking his feelings. But along the way, not only has he been expressing his feelings about the women, but he's also been breaking the rules of painting. And even more so not that long ago. So this one was painted in 1906. And this is only like 40 years down the road from when Manet painted his first Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which was very shocking to the critics. Oh, look at that naked lady sitting there with those gentlemen. This is so shocking. Well, they didn't know from shocking. When they saw this, they were aghast, appalled. Not only were the women just gruesome looking, but Picasso was also making what seemed to be a mockery of painting in general. So now I want you to tell me, looking at this, not talking just about what he's saying about women, what rules of painting did he break in this? And he broke all kinds of rules. So there's a lot to see here. And don't just focus on the women. Think about their environment. Think about what's all around them. How is he portraying the picture plane? And we talked a little bit about picture plane with Cezanne. How is he taking what Cezanne did and making it even more so? It's kind of crazy. So he's transformed them in a variety of ways. He's transformed the environment in a variety of ways. And he has completely upended the way that we're used to seeing the outside world depicted on the canvas. Is he still referencing the outside world? Absolutely, right? You see references to people, obviously there's fruit. You can even see references to nature. See the sky in the middle and the sun? Yeah. Picasso apparently did not intend to revolutionize painting when he made this. He showed it to some of his Parisian friends, his painter friends, when he was finished with it. And they were shocked. They were horrified. Painters like Matisse, just shocked, hated it, thought he was just being disrespectful to women, thought he was being disrespectful to painting. But he did have one colleague, a French painter named Georges Braque, who really did like it and thought that Picasso was onto something, and thought that he was being incredibly innovative. Braque saw not only Picasso's response to the women, but he saw a whole new way of thinking about the canvas, a whole new way of depicting the outside world, of manipulating it to be what you, the artist, the god of the canvas, wanted to be, rather than what the outside world is telling it should be. So Braque saw that Picasso was literally shattering the picture plane. Okay, so I'm gonna let you finish talking about how he did that. In what way did he shadow that picture painting? And then we'll move on. All right. So this was an amazing painting. It really broke a lot of rules, and changed the way. I mean, I've been saying that every painting we look at almost is changing the rules, but this one went far, and it took people a long time to adjust to it. But interestingly, Picasso didn't hold back. Here's some examples of the Iberian art that Picasso was very influenced by. And you can see that he borrowed liberally from the Iberian masks, especially in some of the faces of the characters, the female characters in this. So after Braque saw Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, he went back to his studio and immediately started thinking this way. He started thinking about, well, how else can I break up the picture plane? How can I take what's out there in the world in this the spatially organized reality that we all live in, and reorganize it in a different way on my canvas. And he made, this is one of his very early paintings after he saw the Demoiselle. It's called Houses at L'Estaque. It was made in 1908. And he decided, why do painters worry so much about space and depicting a sense of space? Why don't we think about really showing what's there, the surface of the painting, which is a flat surface? Why not emphasize that? That's more real than this illusion of space. So I'm going to take you back a little bit more to here. Remember this guy? I hope you do. This is Cezanne, who many call the father of modernism. And are you starting to see the little cubes? Remember, I called them patches of color, all his little patches of color all over the painting. If you look at it from this perspective, look at how Cezanne was kind of the guy who innovated this in the first place, although he didn't completely break with this idea of recognizable shapes and recognizable space. He was playing with that tension between the illusion of space that most canvases sought to depict and the reality of the flat surface, which it was. So this kind of tension between the illusion and the reality, which then Picasso and Braque said, to hell with illusion. Let's just paint the reality. And the reality is that this canvas is an artificial surface upon which we're painting ideas. Why does it have to look like the outside world? And they started realizing it doesn't have to. We can make it look any way we want. So they decided to break not 100%, but mostly from the real nature, from nature outside of them. They were much more interested in paring down and painting symbols of what their subject was, rather than depicting what they saw and trying to reproduce what they saw. They were very much interested in symbolism, and they were interested in almost like a mathematic way of depicting images. And it was about this painting, which is called The Violin and the Palette, that the term cubist was born. A critique described it as a painting constructed entirely out of small cubes. And that's how the title of the movement got its name. Braque showed this painting to Picasso, and their partnership was born. They worked closely together in their movement, both bringing different elements to their partnership. And they formed this movement, which would then be called analytic cubism, because a lot of what they did was very much in their minds, their way they conceived of the world. So this painting that we're looking at now is by Georges Braque, and it's called Violin and Palette. So look at it carefully for a minute. What else do you see beside the violin and palette? Can you see the palette? The palette's way up here, and the violin is broken up into multiple pieces here. What else do you see? Some of it's hard to figure out. I can see music. And then there are these other elements that are a little bit harder to tell. Why did they break the violin up so much? What were they trying to do with that? And some people say that they were trying to show multiple angles of one object in one painting, which there's probably some truth in that. But I also think they were trying to get to the essence of what that object was. And it's interesting to me that this was all about art, right? The visual art and music and the marriage of the two. But notice how desaturated it is. There's really no color. So they weren't interested in that kind of emotional response that one would get with color. So they're desaturating, they're taking out all the color. So it's much more of an intellectual exercise. And maybe they're more interested in shape and rhythm than they are in like color or feeling. This is the painting in the AP by Georges Braque called The Portuguese. And yeah. So, and Braque, oh, I've got another page about Braque here somewhere. Portuguese is about the Portuguese, and I'm sure you read about it in the Khan Academy, was in response to a concert, I guess, or a club performance that Braque had been to. And one of the things that we see a lot in Cubist work is the inclusion of numbers and letters and words, actually. Here's another, this is a slightly more, I think this one is a little bit more natural, the color that it was. Yeah, and it was about, it wasn't meant to be multiple views of that experience, but a feeling of what that experience was like. So just to capture the essence of what that I think probably jazz music felt like to Braque. And you'll notice that that this painting is a lot flatter. It doesn't reference space in any way, and it's even hard to pick out the pieces of the instruments. You can see little references to strings and other elements, but it's actually really difficult to piece it all together. Oops, sorry about that. I'm gonna go ahead and go back in. I apologize. There we go. Sorry about that. All right. So one of the things that happened as both Picasso and Braque kind of kept going further and further down this road of abstraction into Cubism was that they both eventually pulled back a little bit. This one is called Marjolie by Picasso. And as they get further and further away from reality and they reference outside world less and less, they kind of got they got a little bit maybe scared isn't the right word, but they finally realized that they didn't want to go all the way to abstraction without any reference to the outside world, and so they stopped. And Picasso did not believe in complete non-representational art. He said, quote, you have to start somewhere, and so he always referenced the outside world in his work. He said, you take a nice curve from here, a shadow from there, and you put it together to form a strong composition, which is entirely free of its source of origin. To reconstitute a completely original thing from its parts, looking not for a visual reality, but the reality of a concept. And that is Picasso's thought of what they were doing. Eventually, they turned to away from analytic cubism as it got kind of too close to non-representational art, and they turned towards this style, which is another form of cubism called synthetic cubism. And in here, you can see they're synthesizing. Here, Picasso is synthesizing multiple elements, including painted paper. You can see that there's newspaper, there's wallpaper into a composition. And let's go, I really love this one. This one's called A Bottle of Suze, and a Suze was an alcoholic drink. And you can maybe see a slight form of a table that it seems to be sitting on. Let's go to this one. I love this one. This one is called Still Life with a Bowl of Fruit. And and it's lovely. I mean, I think you can just about imagine what this is trying to recreate. You can see the fruit, the pears or apples. You can see a violin here. You can also see a glass, and you can see the newspaper and what appears to be maybe a tabletop or a chair. And you can just imagine that this kind of came to him as he was sitting and enjoying his coffee and some fruit and listening to some classical music and reading the paper. And he wanted to capture the feeling of what this experience was, all in this one work of art, in this synthesized thing. He and Brock actually also moved eventually into three-dimensional work, but they didn't keep doing that for very much longer. This is called The Mandolin and the Clarinet. Okay, so this painting is a big mural that Picasso made much later in 1937 at the Spanish Pavilion at the World Exposition in Paris in 1937. And it's one of his most famous works. It's called Guernica. And Guernica is about the atrocities of war that happened under the dictator Franco. And when Franco called on Hitler to bomb his own people in Spain. And this was Picasso's response to that. So it was a shocking, of course, it was a shocking and horrific attack, and Picasso's response was also, one to show that shock and horror. And as you can see, he has moved back away from that total abstraction of Cubism to a simpler, more symbolic way of depicting things. And Franco is shown as the bull, and you can see suffering women and dead babies and suffering horses and dead people on the ground. He's trying very hard in his symbolic way to show the horrors of this attack. And this one is really interesting to see this eye with the light bulb in it. Picasso was with this symbol trying to say that the world is watching. This wasn't going to go unpunished, but that the world was aware. The world was watching. Yeah, he went on to have a long and illustrious career. I think he lived until his 90s, and was always reinventing himself. He was an interesting character. Okay, so that was Picasso and Brock and Cubism. Let's move on. The next slide I have is a photograph by an American photographer named Alfred Stieglitz. So this is the one you guys have read about in Khan Academy. This is called The Steerage 1907, and it's a photogravure. And this was a small, he was the leader of a small but influential modernist movement that happened, that was based in New York in this time in the early 1900s. He loved the abstracted work that he saw coming out of Europe, of Picasso and Matisse and others. And he thought this was the future of art, and he was on it. He loved it. But he was a photographer. And so he was trying to figure out ways that his photography could be as modern and as stylized and as abstracted as the painting that was coming out of Europe. And it was interesting. He used a new handheld type of camera that was made by the Kodak company to capture fleeting moments, and he was especially drawn to the cityscape of New York. He was the person who discovered and later married the brilliant American modern artist Georgia O'Keeffe, and they had a tumultuous relationship throughout their lives. And the Khan Academy article called the Stieglitz photograph, The Steerage, one of the most important photographs in history. And that's an interesting and very strong statement to make. So let's talk about this. This is a this is a this is an interesting painting or photograph, both for the composition as well as the content. So I think we should talk. I'll talk about the content a little bit, and then I want you to answer questions about the style and the way that it's composed, and what makes it this most important photograph in history, according to the art historians of Khan Academy. So we're looking at a boat. So the steerage. Do you guys know what the steerage is in a boat? Well, just like in planes, there's first class and second class. Steerage was the worst class in a boat. It's for the people who had no money and who were coming across the ocean from Europe to America with the cheapest possible ticket. So they would be the poorest possible people. And so that section of the boat would just be crammed with those people. They wouldn't have anywhere near the comfort and accommodations or food of the people who are in the upper classes of the boat. And one of the things you might notice is where Stiglitz is taking this photograph. Where is he taking it from? Is he there with the folks in steerage? Notice the distance between him, the photographer, and the people. He's not in the middle of them. He's looking at them. And he's looking at them from across a divide. Notice how this kind of gangway, this small little walkway, connects where these guys all are in steerage. So this is the whole steerage section on this side, to this gangway connects to maybe the higher class, the first class or whatever, the higher class part of the boat, which is where Stiglitz was. But it's interesting, his view, his eye, what he's seeing there in the steerage. Do you think it's full of judgment or what? I think he's looking at them almost wistfully. My guess is he thinks they look, yeah, there's a lot of them crowded into this tight space, but they look they look together. They look like they've got each other. They look like they have community in a way that I think Stieglitz looks upon them with longing. So there's a certain wistfulness. Now, of course, Stiglitz being the upper class guy, he doesn't know the hardships of their life. He doesn't know what it's like to be hungry or not have a house or other things that these people might have experienced. And that's probably why these folks are coming to the United States to make a new life for themselves. He hasn't experienced that, so he can't really relate with them because he doesn't know what it's like to be to lack the basics in life. But instead, he's looking at them with this kind of almost romantic view. So it's cramped and uncomfortable and sometimes unhealthy. But he found this to be a much more interesting place, and this view of humanity to be so much more interesting than the upper class folks who kind of held themselves apart. And in a way, his attitude about the steerage class travelers is a little bit like Daumier's. Remember the third class carriage that we looked at his? And you can see that he doesn't really feel sorry for them, that he's shooting them with empathy, that there's a sense of almost envy of their humanity, something warm that he's viewing them with. Okay, so that's the content. The content's pretty simple, right? It's not that big a deal. He's shooting these immigrant people as they come across on the ship. So now I want you to look at it in terms of composition and as an abstract composition. So yes, it's people, it's a boat, it's all these parts of a boat. Yeah, those are the things. But if you take it and break it down, it's made of shapes. So without looking at, oh, that's the, the walkway that I referred to, this walkway here, or that's the railing, I want you to look at the parts of this photograph, the things that hold it together, and identify those elements. And so now what I want you to do in writing in VoiceThread is I want you to tell me about how this photograph, how he uses shape in this photograph. I'm going to restate this. How did he use shape in this photograph to in a very modern way, show us the separation between the classes and the togetherness of the steerage class? What shapes hold people apart and tie them together? And I don't want you to tell me faces. I want you to tell me about shapes. Stick with shapes. So tell me about the shapes. How do the shapes he uses in this photograph compose the photograph? How does he use shape to create a way of holding the image together? And this is a hard question because I'm asking you to think abstractly about something which is not abstract. So I'm actually asking you to kind of abstract it for me. And this was considered, what he did with this photograph, quite revolutionary. All right, let's just peek at a few other of Stiglitz's photographs. This is called the Flatiron Building in New York. And again, these monumentally wonderful shapes that he simply pares down in his photographs. This is a self-portrait of Stiglitz himself. And here's his wife, Georgia O'Keeffe. And these very famous photographs of Georgia's beautiful, very delicate hands. All right. Woo! We haven't talked at all about color, and now we're going to go back into color for our last artist. So after Cubism started, so many things, so many movements started happening all at the same time. Many expressionist movements began in the turn of the century. So we have the Impressionists, we have the Post-Impressionists, and after the Post-Impressionists, we see artists splintering off in a whole bunch of different ways. So Cezanne goes in one way where he's kind of deconstructing the picture plane and going towards cubism and abstraction. And the folks that followed Van Gogh, the idea of using color and emotion to be able to express ideas and concepts, that bred the expressionist movement. And this is the work of Andre Derain, who was one of the first expressionists, and he was part of a group called the Fauves, F-A-U-V-E-S, Fauve, which means wild thing. So they were the wild ones. We're not going to be looking too much at Derain's work. You can see that how it relates a little bit to Van Gogh's work. And he loved Van Gogh's idea of using color to express emotion. Another person who was a major player in the Fauves was this painter named Henri Matisse. And this is some of Matisse's early work. This is a woman with a hat. And you can see he's playing here a little bit with impressionist kind of brushwork and all of that kind of thing. But as Matisse goes and starts working on his mature style, he pares his work down. It becomes much simpler, much more elegant, and starts really getting rid of all the elements that don't matter to him. We're going to pause for a second and take a look at this one, which is called The Joy of Life, Le Bonheur de Vivre. And you can see maybe Gauguin's influence here with the kind of this back to nature, naked women, and almost like a tropical environment. The place, it's interesting how he's really dumping all kinds of conventions. He doesn't really reference the colors that you see in nature very much. He certainly doesn't reference space. You see the people have the form of humans, but they're very flat, they're very stylized, and they don't relate to each other or to the environment that they're in with any sort of scale. He doesn't care about the proportion of the people in any sort of realistic way. Um, and in his mind, each element of the canvas is just as important as each other element, and he wants each element to play off the other element. He's very interested in he's in color and beautiful lyrical line and these flowing, gorgeous shapes. Um, he's trying to mix gentle warms like the yellows, the oranges, and the pinks with darker, cool greens, teals, and purples to create a kind of push and a pull. But it's all meant to give a sense of calm and a sense of serenity. And you'll notice that he's referencing classical art. Um, Whoops, these figures are very, very classical. And some of these figures even almost look like Renaissance humanist figures. So he's referencing ancient art history. Here's another Matisse from that period, which is called Harmony in Red. It was made in 1908. And here he's playing with this idea of foreground and background, and he's letting the mind play back and forth with that, like what's in front and what's in back and what's flat and what has shape, what has form. And he's saying, it doesn't really matter. I can paint this without shape or form, and I can pretend, I can play with foreground and background. Look at the how much fun he has playing with the yellow circles of the lemons or fruit, whatever this is, and these repeated yellow shapes back here, and the repeated yellow dots up here. He's playing with all of these shapes in a way that's more childlike and playful than it is anything. Eventually, Matisse comes to the conclusion that painting should be made to give pleasure. I mean, he is a little bit like Monet, and he doesn't want painting to be heavy and controversial. He says painting should be welcoming, like a good armchair. He wanted his art to evoke a sense of peace and happiness when people looked at it. He was an anxious man, and he wanted his paintings to bring joy to people, which is really interesting. So the piece that's actually on the AP, and we'll go to this, is this one, which is called The Goldfish. It was painted a little bit later in 1912. It's an oil on canvas, and as you can see, it's kind of a deceptively simple painting. Instead of a big grand scene with the nude women and stuff, this is just like a little still life of a clear glass cylinder of fish on a table. So it's very simple. And you might think, why the fish? Why this table? Well, I'm sure you guys read the article in the Khan Academy that he had the opportunity to go visit Morocco, which is in northern Africa, and he was so impressed with their pace of life, that the pace of life was calm, it was relaxed, people weren't rushing around getting from this business appointment to that business appointment. They really took long breaks during the day. They were able to sit and read and be with people. He loved this idea of finding peace and calm instead of having a hectic, rushing around kind of life. And he loved that. He wanted his paintings to reflect that slower way of life that he found there in Morocco, to be more contemplative. He felt this was paradise. And this painting was one of the ways that he tried to recollect that paradise that he felt. But it wasn't done in Morocco. It was done in his own garden in France. And I think part of the message was to tell folks that you can find this kind of paradise. You can find this escape. You can find this place to be peaceful in your own world, even in your own backyard. So I'm going to ask two questions of you in this as you analyze this. And I want you to answer me this, two things. One, how did Matisse show paradise in this small painting? So maybe each of you can answer one or two things. So how does this small painting show paradise? What about it communicates this idea of joy, of happiness, of paradise, sublime happiness? So that's the first question. And then the second question is, what, what compositional device or devices did he use in this to hold this, to make this painting such a great composition? This is a really deceptive painting. It's super simple. The focus is right there in the middle. You know, the fish, which are obviously the subject, sit right smack in the middle of the painting. But what about this painting? What has he done to compose it and make it really interesting and um, not predictable? It's kind of unpredictable in a way. So you're going to be answering how he's giving us a sense of paradise, and how is he really interestingly composing this very seemingly simple painting, not so simple as it turns out. So Matisse and Matisse and Picasso, interestingly enough, kind of worked side by side in Paris. Picasso, although he was Spanish, lived in Paris most of his life, and they were kind of friends, but competitors, a little bit frenemies, and they had really different takes. And you can really see, I think, easily they were both very successful. They were both critically acclaimed, but they had really different approaches to painting, and they really had different ideas about what was important. Here's a few more of Matisse. You can see this is a painting that he painted while he was in Morocco. And here are the Moroccans enjoying goldfish. And this is one of his very, very last big paintings, large scale paintings. In the end of his life, Matisse actually went blind and was no longer able to see to paint. This one's called The Dance, created in 1909. And you can see here, again, the figures in the background, all the shapes are important. And it's all this very tightly composed interplay of color and form. And again, always about the beauty and about the joy. And then finally, later in his career, you can see this one was created in 52, and that's 1952. Here he was a very old man and he was blind at this point. And so he was creating his compositions by cutting paper so he could feel the paper. And he had an assistant who would lay the paper down for him. And in the end, he kept making art all the way until his last days, and because this was part of his life, was the creative impulse, but always still looking for that amazing interplay between color and form, background and foreground. His life. Okay, that is it for this one. I think we only had 3 questions, so maybe I'll only ask you to answer. I mean, maybe 2 of them are tied together, so maybe 4. So I'll give you 12 points for you to get all of those questions down in VoiceThread. Okay.